Civilization 7 made headlines again this week, cited in Gamerant as being long overdue. And I think they're right. But not as long overdue as it is for you to hit that red button and join us as we beeline towards 25,000 subscribers. We are so close. Now, why is Civilization 6 long overdue to have a replacement, likely by the name of Civilization 7? Well, it could be, firstly, something that wasn't even mentioned in the Gamerant article, although we will get to that in a minute, be to do with something like these games: Arda History Untold, the newly announced 4X historical strategy game being published by Microsoft, likely being released in a technical alpha later this year. Or perhaps Humankind, which released to mixed reviews, also a 4X historical strategy game. However, since its release, it's received a variety of patch updates. All of them have been fairly well received, to my knowledge, by the community, and of course these DLC updates with a variety of new cultures. And of course those games aren't alone. If you stretch slightly further out from the subgenre of 4X, you find a whole load of other brilliant games, such as, for example, Victoria 3, also releasing and continuing to be worked on throughout this year and into 2023. It's a hot time in 4X historical strategy games in particular. So then, with Civilization 6 as our backdrop, let's talk a little bit about Civilization 7. And we'll start with Gamerant's argument. Gamerant argue that Civilization 7 is long overdue, and I'm sure that many of you, particularly if you're a core Civilization player, Civ 5 and certainly Civilization 6, feel very much the same. There are essentially four key reasons to their argument, although they don't mention the first one that I've just recalled, that the competition is heating up. But alongside of that, they mention that Civilization 6 has had and lived a very successful life cycle. While it didn't launch with overwhelmingly positive reviews, it was very different from the Civilization 5 that it replaced in terms of graphics, or perhaps how the districts and cities were planned out, unit promotions and movement, the culture tree, right? All of those sorts of things were big sweeping changes that clearly required a lot of development and insight. Now, since then, though, it's received, of course, some major DLC upgrades, right? From the early days of Rise and Fall, right the way through to the New Frontier Pass, now the Anthology, and of course a series of small civilizations added in throughout the mix, as well as a series of free patch updates. And I recall the last one, I covered it on the channel in May of 2011, but we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. The Gamerant argues that essentially Civilization 6 has now kind of ran its course. They argue, as I just mentioned, that we haven't seen any new content for Civilization 6 in over a year. And of course, if we read between the lines a little bit, let's not forget that this is indeed a commercial operation. As much as we might enjoy Civilization as players, it's of course also a franchise out to drive growth, jobs, and ultimately, I guess, grab a larger share of that sweet, sweet historical strategy gaming market. So it makes sense that they would want to be at least updating, releasing, or reminding us of what they're working on. Now, to their credit, Civilization 6 remains probably the most popular game in the franchise. It still has an incredible number of players playing it, if Steam player counts are anything to go by, at least. And many people would argue that it is still the kingpin, and that it simply doesn't need anything more. It's sort of done. And indeed, the developers signaled that, calling, of course, that final May 2021 update as the, quote, final free update for Civilization 6. It seems likely that the game has, at this point, ran its course. Would I completely rule it out? No, but I think that anything more coming to Civilization 6, other than perhaps something small, maybe something for a holiday event or a small update or addition or something along those lines, maybe a teaser for a future game, for example, anything outside of that is really an outside chance. I think at this point, Civilization 6 has concluded and ran its course, and I tend to agree with their thesis there. They go on to argue, though, and this is a really interesting point, that between Civilization 5 and Civilization 6, there was roughly the same amount of time that we've had between Civilization 6 and now, a period of roughly 5 or 6 years. Now, that's all fine and good. You could say, well, it took them about 6 years last time, so it should take them about 6 years this time. And that might be reasonable enough. However, as Gamerant point out, let's not forget that in the period between Civilization 5 and Civilization 6 releasing, we also saw the release of Civ Beyond Earth, that sort of follow on from what happened after Civilization 5 and take Civ to the stars. It was a fully fledged Civ game. Of course, it wasn't a historical strategy game because it was set beyond Earth, and there were sort of these rivaling sort of post-apocalyptic Earth factions of different political or geopolitical leanings. Either way, it's actually a really enjoyable game after its DLC released, but it also suffered a particularly brutal launch. I was part of that bonfire and sort of pitchfork raising exercise myself, so I'm a little bit guilty as charged there perhaps. But anyway, that's a story for another day. I digress. The main point here is that Beyond Earth and Rev 2 came out between Civ 5 and Civ 6 releasing. Whereas after Civilization 6, we've seen nothing of the sorts. No spin-off games, no mobile games, at least not directly out of firaxis. Although what we have seen, and again, this wasn't mentioned in the Gamerant article, but I think it's important to mention because it sprung to my mind straight away, or at least I don't recall reading it in the Gamerant article, is the fact that Civilization 6 has been expanded out very far. No, we haven't seen a spin-off, the sci-fi Beyond Earth or a Rev 2, but we have seen Civ 6 brought to other platforms, granted by other development teams with other expertise being brought in alongside firaxis, for example, but we have seen the slow and steady expansion of Civilization 6. More DLC has been released for Civ 6 than ever before. The new Frontier Pass was also, it's important to note, released over a long period of time, right? It was released over something like 9 months, a sort of a gradual drip feeding of content. And very much, and I might talk about this a little bit later in the video, sort of that kind of Battle Pass seasonality theme that we're seeing in lots of other games. Anybody who's played something like Call of Duty or Fortnite or I don't know, any other game that uses a sort of a Battle Pass seasons-like function will be familiar with how that can sort of play out. And in many ways, I argue, we saw the new Frontier Pass play out in that way for Civilization 6. So yes, they're right. We didn't see a lot from firaxis between 6 and now, I should say, in the same way that we saw extra content between Civ 5 and 6. However, what we did see was a progressional even, expansion of Civ 6 out onto a variety of different platforms. You can play it on your Switch or mobile or what have you, but also more content than ever before. It was a much more fully fledged experience, at least in terms of the volume of content that was given to it by firaxis. And I, for one, actually really thankful for that. I would like to see that design philosophy brought forward to a lot of games. If I really love a game, I'd like to see its lifespan extended rather than it being dumped and replaced by something purely just to drive new sales. That could just be me, but that's how I feel. Lastly, and the final point to sort of I guess bring together the one that I brought to the table and the 4 others from the Gamerant article. Although really it wasn't really stressed again in the Gamerant article, but I think it's important to note firaxis also not just working on Civ, of course. Let's not forget XCOM, another baby of firaxis, and that has received, to my knowledge, some releases since then. I think there was that slightly smaller release, the name of which escapes the top of my head, and I don't have it written down in my poorly scrawled notes next to me on my pen and paper here. I think it was Chimera Squad or something along those lines. Either way, they're working on that. They've got Civ, but more importantly, they have Marvel Midnight Suns, the new sort of tactical strategy game coming out of firaxis later this year, licensed officially, fully fledged by Marvel. I'm looking forward actually to seeing how that one plays out. So far, the perspectives from people who have been able to have a slight early access look at it have been fairly positive. They're working on that, so maybe probably not the time to either A, be working on, or B, more likely, be releasing and marketing a Civilization 7. Perhaps that just doesn't make sense. I don't know. I'm not a game developer or publisher, but it seems to me like you probably wouldn't want to be working on a whole load of things and then pump them all out at the same time unless it was an extra special reason to do so. So with that of our backdrop then, let's talk about some Civilization 6 release date ideas, release date theories. When does it make sense for this game to come out? And I've actually had a few discussions like this before, and regular viewers will note that as well. And I'd like to draw on and bring a couple of those on screen now. One dominant one, as highlighted here by Pete, Civ 5's last expansion was March 2013. 6 came out in October 2016, 3.5 years later. Civ 6's New Frontier Pass was March 2021. Therefore, 3.5 years makes it October 2024 for a release date of Civilization 7, scaling it roughly appropriately by looking at it from its end of life. Another common thread here, take a look at this one here. Reality Lime says, I was hoping for a 22 launch, but it's looking like late 23 at the earliest, due to release success of competition, making them reconsider things. A very attractive looking user by the name of, what's that, Jumbo Pixel says, could very well be, combined with possible worker shortages, global supply constraints, and a tricky economic and political climate. Somebody's trying to sound pretty intelligent there, aren't they? And then Bob Johnson goes on to highlight that Civilization 6 was announced in May of 2016 before releasing in October of that same year. I would point out here that that is a really fast turnaround, right? There's not a huge, big sort of 8, 9 month, 12-month plus build-up of alphas and releases and trailers and nonsense. A 4-month turnaround for a AAA title is fairly quick. Bob goes on to say that they think there's a decent chance an announcement for Civilization 7 releasing in 2022 could come as late as E3 release in December. So broadly speaking, people are roughly aligned from what I've seen and covered here broadly on the channel and looking across the market, is that we seem to think that at the earliest it could be the very end of this year, and maybe at the latest we're looking at 2024. Now, there are some other outside theories around release dates. Some of them are a little more ring-fenced and obvious. Some of them a little more out there, but not necessarily out of the question. In my opinion, and this is but my humble opinion, and please do share yours in the comments below if you'd like to engage in some free, frank, and respectful discussion in the comments section. A rarity, I know, but do share it below. I think that there are essentially 4 different release models, if you will, at play here. Release model number 1, there is some kind of scaling. It may be a linear one. 3.5 years after the final release is from the previous game, as Pete pointed out earlier, is roughly about the amount of time that they like to take before they release their next main series game, so we should expect 2024. Fair enough. There are other ways that it could scale within this model, though. It's not just that 3.5 year point that it could scale by. For example, instead of it being from the end of the previous game's release, it could instead scale up by difficulty, by technological prowess and power. So it goes from the first one taking 5 years, the next one taking 7, the next one taking 9. Maybe it scales up exponentially and we could be looking at a doubling. I don't know. But there is a theory that there is some kind of scaling here at play, and that will determine when it releases. The 2 dominant sub-theories within that being 3.5 years after Civ 5, or maybe because Civilization 7 will be more ambitious, more technologically difficult than the rest. It's just going to take that little bit, that marginal bit longer than the previous time. The second theory is that there'll be a side release instead, that we're all actually focusing slightly on the wrong prize here. The prize is not Civilization 7. The prize, at least in the short term, is yet to come. It's a sort of a Beyond Earth 2 or an Alpha Centauri 2, if you will. Or maybe it's a Revolution 3 or some other kind of previous spin-off game, Sid Meier's Pirates, remastered and brought sort of into the modern era. And that's entirely a possibility, especially when you consider some of the other theories that lead in here, right? The next one, for example, is actually a great one, but we could also lean back and think, well, maybe they're working on other games, like, for example, some of the ones that we discussed earlier on. Maybe Firaxis is busy with their Marvel game, right? Maybe they're busy working on XCOM 3. So they're gonna do a side release within the Civilization franchise instead of focusing on a big Civ 7 release, because Civ 6 is doing plenty well enough. We'll do a side release in a bit and then do a Civ 7 well down the line. Potentially, that's a possibility. I thought it's a fun theory, one that I've been theory crafting myself a little bit, and it would be rude not to share it, dare I say. The third one that I've crafted is that there will be some sort of new formula at play here instead. That the Civilization 4 to 5, sure, we changed the tiles, we changed some units, whatever. Civilization 5 to 6, sure, we changed the districts, the culture tree, whatever. Yes, they were fairly significant changes, but they weren't overarching changes to the fundamental structure of the game, right? Sure, the districts are different. Sure, the units are on hexes instead of squares or what have you. But what if the actual release structure of the game differed entirely? What if they said, hey, the new Frontier Pass worked really well. Why don't we release an entire game like that? Why don't we make, instead of Civilization 7, just make Sid Meier's Civilization? Civ Online. Oh, don't call it that. Bad connotations. But make some sort of overarching game that is maybe free to play. Maybe that's the way they change it up. I don't know. But there's a different release model, potentially something free to play. It comes out, everybody can access it. And then the extra content is the paid variety, or the customization to the character, or what have you. A very popular model in games like Fortnite, for example, that have proven that a free-to-play title, if it's well polished, well delivered, kept up to date, fresh, and most importantly, really interesting to its targeted player base, because my God, you cannot deny that Fortnite has done that well. Maybe we could see a completely different model. I doubt this. I think this is my sort of eye in the sky, really out there dreamers model. It may not even work, right? They could have thought about it, could be total garbage. I don't know. But I think that there is maybe a very outside chance that we see a refreshed formula entirely and altogether, and we're completely thinking in the wrong place. And last but not least, a more simple theory. A policy analyst might call this the status quo model. It's just simply that this release is late. Don't overthink it. It's a late release. Maybe it's because games get more complicated. Maybe it's because they were busy. Maybe it's because they were contracted by Marvel and decided to put it on hold. I don't know. It could be any of those things that we just discussed and more. But fundamentally, Civilization 7 is just running a bit late. Thank you very much for joining me today in this Civilization 7 theory discussion video. I do think that they're right, that Gamerant and many others, and many of you in the discussion in previous videos are right. Civilization 7 is overdue. Looking back at history, it feels at the very least due around now. I guess we'll have to wait and see what firaxis has to offer for the rest of the year. But with Marvel Midnight Suns coming out, and with many other things capturing our attention outside of the Civilization franchise, potentially with things like Art of History Untold, Humankind, Victoria 3, maybe many others, I think that regardless, firaxis have got lots of competition to fight with. It'll be really interesting to see how they choose to handle it with their next Sid Meier's Civilization release. Thank you very much for watching. Do let me know your theories below, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Hey, and also a big thanks to everybody who supports the channel, whether you like the videos or whatever, or you're a channel member or a Twitch subscriber or a patron. I really appreciate it. I know times are tough out there right now, so stay strong, and thank you so much for your support. I'll see you in the next one.